Good morning and a warm welcome to today's webinar, where we are going beyond segregation and exploring how Nordic countries are planning for socially inclusive cities. My name is Annika Östman. I'm head of communications here at Nordic Region, and I'll be the host for today's session. For those of you joining us for the first time, Nordic Region is a research institute established by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we focus on regional development and planning. We're thrilled to have so many many of you with us today as we share the results from a 3-year research project on this topic. We also have some external speakers, but we'd also love to hear from all of you. So please stay engaged in the chat. Come with your questions and comments there. Now let's take a look at the agenda and see what we have in store for you today. The next hour and a half are split into more or less 4 parts. We'll start with research presentations by Mats Stjernberg, who is lead author for this report. And then we'll hear from speakers from across the Nordic with their take on each topic. First, we will examine policies to counteract segregation and promote social inclusion, hearing from Mats and Venla Bernelius from the Ministry of Education and Culture in Finland. Then Mats will examine measuring segregation, how data and indicators shape policy, and will be joined by Magnus Jakobsson from Boverket in Sweden. Then we'll turn to look at engaging communities. Mats will explore the role of public participation, and we will hear from Bettina Werner from the Danish Co-Urban. Then Mats will ask, what role does the built environment play in social inclusion? And finally, after all these presentations and discussions, we'll wrap up with some key takeaways, looking at the lessons for the future of Nordic cities with Janna Nevelainen from the Ministry of Environment. Our planned speaker, Suvi Antala, is unfortunately sick, but we're very glad that Janna was able to join us last minute. But before we dive into the discussions, I'd like to get a sense of who is with us here today. So we're going to launch a quick poll. And if you all could let us know your background and what topic of today's webinar you're most interested in, we'd love to hear that. And while you do that, I'm going to outline a few practicalities. This webinar is recorded. It will be provided to you after the event. We'll also share the presentations. They'll also be on our website. And as part of today's event, we're launching a flagship report. We'll make sure to share that as well. It will also be a link in the chat. Now, if you've already responded to the poll, maybe you could give this chat a go. Let us know what city you're joining us from today. And of course, if you already have any comments or questions, feel free to add those as well. Now, I'd just like to mention that our insights here today build off of the work we've been doing in a Nordic thematic group for green and inclusive development. This group was formed by the Nordic Committee of Senior Officials for Regional Planning. And we'd like to thank all the members that have been part of this group for 4 years for their insights and for joining us here today. But now let me invite Mats to kick off the presentations and dive into the webinar. Mats, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annika, and good morning also on my behalf. My name is Mats Stjernberg. I'm a senior research fellow here at Nordic Region. As we heard, I'm the lead author of this report that we have been working on for the last 3 years approximately. The report focuses on the issue of segregation and social inclusion. And essentially what we do is conducted a Nordic level study where we examined how Nordic governments and cities address these challenges of urban segregation, what kinds of policies are implemented, what kind of strategies there are, also urban planning, in what ways do Nordic governments and cities seek to counteract segregation and enhance social inclusion in urban environments. As we heard in the introduction from Annika, this is an outcome of a Nordic thematic group project. And this work was commissioned by the Nordic Thematic Group for Green and Inclusive Urban Development. But without any further ado, I thought that I would go into the report and start off by just mentioning really what the background to this whole study is. And essentially, the study is based on the notion that segregation has increased in Nordic cities in recent decades. And this is something that then has sparked a lot of policy attention concerning these questions. This is also something that we see in the public debate and in the media, where we see growing concerns of segregation and what kinds of societal implications it may have. But in our study, we approached the issue of segregation, looking at different thematic areas. I will now start off my presentation in just a couple of minutes by diving into the first topic, which is essentially about what kind of national strategies there are to reduce segregation and promote social inclusion in cities across the Nordic countries. Then after that, we will get into the second topic, which concerns indicators and how different types of indicators are being used across the Nordics in supporting policies and planning interventions dealing with segregation and social inclusion. The third topic deals with public participation and citizen involvement in policy and planning interventions. And then the fourth one explores the interconnection between the built environment and the social environment in neighborhoods. So in the report that is published today, each of these four themes is examined in a dedicated chapter. And you could say that for all of the themes, we look at this through a multi-level governance lens. So we look at what kind of state level policies and strategies there are, and then also looking more at the local level, then looking at how different Nordic cities and municipalities are implementing different kinds of policies and interventions dealing with these questions. This study is based on a qualitative approach, looking at different kinds of policy documents, planning documents, and so forth, and then a long range of expert interviews conducted in the different Nordic countries and in different Nordic cities. We've conducted city case studies and looked at 13 different Nordic cities, and the findings that I will be presenting now draw on the conclusions from these different case studies. So to start off with the first topic, which essentially deals with the national level and what the national policy landscape looks like concerning strategies to prevent segregation and to promote social inclusion in Nordic cities. I thought that I would start off by looking at what are the common characteristics of the Nordic policy landscape. What are the common features that we can find? As mentioned, as we saw it on one of the first slides, that this is something that this topic has emerged in policy debates, in the public debate. Research has been conducted in all the Nordic countries, emphasizing the growing trends of segregation that we see. And essentially, all the Nordic countries have, to some extent, designed different kinds of national level policies to counteract these developments. But of course, we see that there are different prioritizations. The focus may vary from one country to another. Of course, a common feature that we see is that in many cases, these policies deal with different policy areas. So it's not just dealing with urban planning or housing policy, but rather interlinking different policy areas ranging from housing policy, educational policy, employment policy, integration, but also planning of the built environment and public services. These are not all the focus areas, but some of the most important ones that we found in our Nordic study. Another common tendency is the increased emphasis on cooperation and partnerships between different key actors. So here, essentially, we're talking about cooperation between the national level, ministries, government agencies, and then, of course, regional authorities, local authorities, and municipalities, but also civil society organizations, and then the increasing emphasis on citizen engagement and involvement of other key stakeholders in local communities. So this is definitely a common denominator for the Nordic countries. Another issue that I thought is worth emphasizing here as well is that even though many of these policies are rather cross-cutting, another common tendency is that area-based regeneration projects are quite common in all the Nordic countries. There, meaning that there are specific interventions being carried out in certain neighborhoods. And then, of course, there are many common characteristics that we can find, but also there are also different approaches in the Nordic countries. I thought that I could just mention two examples here. Sweden is the country where there has been the most comprehensive national strategy dealing with segregation. And here I'm referring to the 2018 long-term strategy to reduce and counteract segregation. And in this strategy, segregation was framed as a complex issue which encompasses different factors ranging from education, labor market, civil society, and crime. So the approach was here rather holistic, looking at segregation as a relational phenomenon where these different aspects intersect and then contribute to segregation. Perhaps the most, or at least the policy approach that has gained the most attention in the media, I would say, is the Danish so-called ghetto strategy, or the strategy for eradicating parallel societies in Denmark, which has, on the other hand, focused much more on immigration from non-Western countries as the primary driver of segregation. And this strategy has been contested largely due to the focus on demolishing housing and also the use of individual sanctions and control measures in specific neighborhoods that are defined as ghettos according to certain quantitative criteria. So these were just two of the examples that I thought are worth highlighting here. More examples can be found in the report itself. And then on a final note, before we move on to the Q&A part of the program, one interesting tendency that we encountered as well, this is a 3-year project, and even during that time, we see that there has been a kind of shift in some of the Nordic countries, and in terms of what the policy priorities are in a given time. For instance, in Sweden and in Finland, along with political shifts at the national level in the countries, the emphasis in the policies and the priorities have shifted somewhat, and we now see a much greater emphasis on gang crime and safety in specific neighborhoods. So even though there is a kind of path dependency where previous policies build on, or new policies build on previous ones, we also see that the Nordic countries are inspired or seem to be taking in learnings from the other neighboring countries. So this is also an interesting observation in a Nordic level study like this. But now we will invite our first external speaker.
Yes, thank you so much, Mats. We're now going to be joined by Venla Bernelius. Hi, Venla. Good morning. Glad to have you with us. Good morning. So Mats didn't really get to dive into Finland much there, but I wanted to ask you, because Finland doesn't have a specific national strategy in dealing with segregation. And How important do you think it is to have a national strategy?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to get to be here with a fantastic report. And that's, I think, is one of the very vital questions also when dealing with segregation. As a geographer, like Mats, also a fellow geographer there, I think my perspective to segregation research is also very strongly focused on the idea that segregation is a national phenomenon that happens locally. And I think that perspective already gives us an idea of why it is vital to have a national, not necessarily a program, but some kind of a strategic idea and some sort of agenda on how to deal with it. We do see through research, I think, all around Europe that if segregation is only treated as a local phenomena and cities are trying to deal with it individually, they end up inventing a lot of wheels and many of the wheels end up looking quite similar. But then, of course, cities struggle with also the questions of how much is much. All cities can identify their own disadvantaged neighborhoods. But in order to get the really sort of broad view, we need the national gaze and perspective, and especially the cooperation, because then some things are only seen locally. So I think also Mats lifted up the Swedish strategy as a good example, and I think we can pinpoint also through research how that national gaze has been quite effective, because in Sweden the national strategy is quite well able to identify the systemic structures in segregation, also identifying and stating very clearly, which you also lifted up in your report, that segregation happens in the whole city. Although we do see its results in individual neighborhoods, it is a process. And I think this is something also that this cooperation between national and local can lift up.
Mm.
And maybe, thank you, Venla. And maybe as a follow-up question, now looking at Finland, could you maybe say a few words about what does you now work at the ministry, and of course there are policy interventions carried out at multiple levels of governance, but what does the interplay look like between the national level and the local level in Finnish cities then?
Yes, the Finnish structure is internationally also quite interesting, because the national state is of course quite strong. The municipalities have a lot of executive power, but there's almost nothing in between. So in Finland, the interplay and the collaboration is very tight between exactly these two stratas of governance. And right now, the cities, together with the national governance, are thinking about also forming national strategies, but the collaboration structures are very sort of matrix-like. And I think this is also quite typical for Nordic countries with relatively low hierarchies, but perhaps the Finnish kind of example is particularly matrix-like in the sense that the collaboration is organized through informal and formal networks with the sort of national and local state. But now I do think that all Nordic countries, we are, like you also state, that we are seeing that segregation is becoming a growing problem, and we kind of perhaps need sort of also new structures and at least new ways to respond, like through this matrix.
Thank you, Venla. And just a reminder to you all to also use the chat if you have any questions for Mats or indeed even Venla on this topic. But I'm going to jump in here and ask you, Venla, what aspects do you think are then crucial to think about when we're talking about policies to counteract segregation and build more inclusive societies?
I think this is the most important question of my life. I have been doing segregation research for 20 years.
Hard to pinpoint it in 1 minute.
So I don't think 2 minutes will quite cut it. You've done a fantastic job, I think, in this report in also kind of taking up these issues. I read through the whole thing on page 220. I think you left one of the very main points, which is the fundamental question of that we need to answer when we think about policies. And that is, do we want to reduce segregation or improve the livability of the disadvantaged neighborhoods? And of course, these goals are often both addressed in different policies, but we need to be analytically very clear on what we actually want to do, because they are very different goals in the end. And if we put all our effort in, for example, just evening out the distribution of people, like reducing the actual measurable residential segregation, we might miss the questions of quality of life and safety and how people feel about their neighborhood. So I think it's the question of that balance. And then of course, the indicators then that we use, maybe as a second point, need to reflect like this understanding that it's both a question of kind of affecting the phenomenon and also then affecting the life quality. Then you lifted up a very fundamental, another important question in your report a couple of times about policies of social mixing also, when you lifted up the argument that social mixing may be seen as treating the sort of symptom instead of treating the cause. And of course, segregation is a symptom of social inequalities in the society. But it's an interesting thing also in, I think, medical research is becoming more and more certain that actually sometimes the symptom can worsen the cause. Like when we have untreated pain, it can actually worsen the underlying conditions. And that is true with segregation also, when we look at how, for example, residential segregation affects school segregation and children's life possibilities. So in fact, I think we need to be also very analytically clear on how the causes and symptoms kind of work and what we want to affect. But then my last point, I promise you don't have to mute me. I'll mute myself in a minute. I'm just so excited about this theme. One last point, that you also very nicely describe how systemic segregation is as a problem. And it is a kind of a nasty, wicked problem in that sense, that it's also difficult to affect sometimes because it stretches over all of our sectors and kind of affects so many things. And I think as a last point, we really need to have a very sort of systemic and strategic view on it, kind of combining different sectors, understanding how we can affect the kind of process from multiple angles. And there, I want to really congratulate your report, because it really lifts up this international level collaboration as well, that we need to have this can-do attitude. Because very often when we have these difficult problems, it's easy for everyone to tell why they can't fix the whole problem, because the problem is so wide. So maybe we rather need to kind of have this strategic understanding of what we can do, like in each sector. What is the systemic kind of role of different institutions and actors in contributing to this? And here, these kinds of wide projects and reports are extremely valuable, because they really sort of make this visible also in an international level. But now I will mute myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Venla, for all those insights. I think you brought a great perspective, not only from Finland, but also through all of your research and looking more broadly at this topic. Thank you so much. Keep your comments coming in the chat. It's already active, and we'll keep them in mind. Venla sort of pivoted a little bit to our next theme on indicators. So I'm going to leave the floor to you again, Mats, to present the second theme.
Thank you. Yes, and thanks, Venla, for the excellent contributions. And also, you mentioning the role of indicators very briefly was a perfect segue to the next part of the program. So the second theme that we explored in the study is the role of indicators. We looked at what role do indicators play in the Nordic countries in supporting policy and planning towards less segregated cities. We also looked at how these indicators are used, by whom, what is their specific role, and also something that we will then go into a bit more in the next Q&A as well. A key question is also what kind of benefits, what added value do these indicators bring? And on the other hand, what kind of challenges and risks are there that we should be conscious of when we talk about these types of indicators? In this second segment of the report, we conducted city case studies looking at 5 Nordic cities, the cities of Odense, Helsinki, Reykjavik, Oslo, and Örebro in Sweden. We were essentially, if we then go to the first part, looking at what role indicators have in the Nordics, A general observation is that indicators are being used at the national level and at the local level, but to a varying degree. In Denmark, we see the strategy of counteracting parallel societies, where they have a classification of the so-called ghetto lists, or the lists of parallel societies, if you will, where neighborhoods are classified into three different categories based on how vulnerable or disadvantaged they are. So this is a concrete example of how indicators are used in direct connection to these segregation-related policies. Another example that we will hear a bit more about in the coming Q&A is the segregation barometer in Sweden, which was developed as a national tool for monitoring segregation and also to support planning and policymaking in the related fields. What's also interesting is that the role of indicators is emphasized in all the countries, but when we're talking about indicators for monitoring segregation nationally, the other Nordic countries do not have common harmonized indicators. But for instance, then Finland and Norway are countries where many municipalities have developed their own monitoring systems. And the city of Helsinki, which we examined in this report, is an example of a city where the city has carried out systematic follow-up of how the city and its different neighborhoods develop for several decades. So this does not mean that there is not a widespread use of indicators in the countries, but what the situation says is that there is no harmonized common indicators that are being used. And then what we also see is that in many smaller municipalities, the municipalities do not have these types of data and indicators to carry out this kind of follow-up. So in that sense, the context is rather fragmented. But in both Norway and Finland, the need for having more common indicators has been acknowledged, and there have been some initiatives towards developing some kind of more common tools that could be somewhat reminiscent of the Swedish segregation barometer. Iceland can be mentioned here as well. Segregation has not historically been a very high question of high policy relevance in the country, but has increasingly in recent years gained more focus, and there a comprehensive social indicator system is being developed. But then going to the question of how are these indicators used and by whom, we identified, you could say, two main areas of use in the case studies that we carried out. So the first one is really about monitoring the status, how the city develops and how different neighborhoods within the city develop over time. And then the second one is more specifically about using indicators to support these policy initiatives and planning interventions. It could be about identifying areas that should be targeted by area-based regeneration initiatives, or then following up on interventions that have been carried out before, looking at the causes or looking at the effects of what has really, of the different types of actions that have been carried out. The segregation barometer, you can see a visualization of that on the right-hand side. This is something that is used to support planning interventions in municipalities across Sweden, and the city of Örebro that we examined is one of those examples where this is used in connection to the urban planning of the city. And what is also worth emphasizing now, when I'm talking about indicators, I'm primarily referring to quantitative ones, but in many cases, quantitative indicators are being complemented by qualitative indicators or qualitative insights to gain a more deeper understanding of local challenges. So in that sense, it's important to also acknowledge that these indicators are being used, but with awareness that we also need to add other types of perspectives when interpreting the data. So then going to the key benefits and challenges of these kinds of indicators. So first of all, what the main added value is, you could say that these types of indicators help us gain a more nuanced understanding of what kind of development patterns there are, what kind of trends there are, and then to identify place-specific challenges. Ideally, indicators are available at multiple scales, meaning that we could examine trends and developments at a very local level and then compare that to the whole city level, to the regional level, to the national level. So the Swedish segregation barometer is an example where this is a very fundamental principle. And then obviously what I already was touching upon, indicators are in many cases used to identify vulnerable areas. And in case this is done in an early stage, we could see this as being a preemptive way of identifying areas and being able to target these with specific interventions before they fall into further decline. And then finally, going into some of the key risks. Obviously, one is misinterpretation, wrongful application. Here, I'm primarily referring to the fact that indicators might be used for other purposes than what they have been developed. So it's also important to acknowledge what has been the intention of the indicators, what has been the aim, what have you wanted to measure, and then to apply these indicators in that kind of context. And then, of course, using indicators can be challenging, and not all municipalities have resources to use indicators. And also, this goes also into how the findings and the observations are interpreted. So if you draw oversimplified conclusions of a very complex issue, such as segregation, then that can be problematic in itself. And then maybe as a final point, before we move to the Q&A segment and invite Magnus from Boverket, we also wanted to emphasize here something that we also found in the report, is that, of course, if indicators are publicly available, then it's also important to be aware of the potential unintended consequences, and that they may, in a worst case, lead to further stigmatization of the areas. So in that sense, they would be leading to unwanted effects and really being counterproductive of what the initial goal has been. But then we will move to the next Q&A again, and yes. Annika is back.
I'm back, and with us now we have, as Mats mentioned, Magnus Jakobsson from Boverket, which is the Swedish National Board of Housing, Building and Planning. Good morning, Magnus. Hello.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation, Mats, and for a very interesting webinar.
Thank you so
really
much
nice
for
to be here.
Us. Yes, we're so happy to have you. And Mats has mentioned quite a lot this Swedish initiative, the segregation barometer, and I thought we'd dive right in and hear from you. How do you see it being used in supporting policies and planning efforts to counteract segregation then in Sweden?
Yeah, I think I will tell you about a little about the segregation barometer, and I think it's very important for the municipality and regions in order to develop sustainability. I think that we need to plan, follow up, and make decisions based on facts, and for that reason, here can the segregation barometer play an important role. Right now, we don't have the exactly numbers of how many organizations that use the tools, but we know that, as Mats mentioned, we know that it's used both at the national level and by quite a lot of municipalities. And the interesting thing about this is that it's used by in very different areas of activity as well. It seems that the most common area of use is in housing and urban planning at different levels, but we can also see that it's used by education administration, but also, and that was a bit of a news for us. It's also used by researchers, like in areas for equal healthcare, and even like for insurance companies and other companies like that. So, as a conclusion, I think that our tool, the segregationsbarometern, plays a role in the work for socially inclusive cities in Sweden.
Thank you, Magnus. And then maybe as a follow-up question, also something that I saw was mentioned in the chat here. We now talked about the segregation barometer, but we also know that there are other tools, and for instance, the Swedish police list. So could you say something about that maybe, and how the two classifications differ and what different roles they may have?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, the Swedish police have this list of over the vulnerable areas, and the purpose of that list is mainly for their own measures, that is police measures, and it's based on. The background is statistics, but it's also based on their own intelligence, like connecting to crime and things like that. So it's mainly not for municipalities to work with. And therefore, actually, we at Boverket and Swedish Statistics Sweden had a project last year where we conducted an analysis of areas with high degree of exclusion that was going to be like another tool that would stand beside the police list. And that tool is used now by government offices as well as another tool. And we also know that there are other municipalities that have created their own tools as well. For example, in Huddinge in southern Stockholm, they have their own Huddinge-analysen as a tool that they use in their municipality.
Thank you, Magnus. And now sort of we've spoken of the benefits and how these indicators can be used, but Mats also touched upon that there are certain risks in using them. How have you seen these play out, or are there other risks that Mats haven't mentioned that you think are important?
I actually think that you mentioned the biggest risk in the presentation. As we see it, the biggest risk at working with indicator is perhaps that they don't tell the whole truth about the geographic area or a certain phenomenon. You always needs to create this holistic understanding of what's behind the number and the statistics, to not draw the wrong conclusions of the problems or the challenges in an area.
Yes.
I think that's the major risk.
And Mats also highlighted some of the benefits, and you've highlighted them here as well. But are there any that you think are worth mentioning that we haven't highlighted yet on the sort of key aspects of why you should work with indicators?
I think it's important to work with indicators. You get comparable results, and it gives you predictability and transparency. For example, in the segregation barometer, we only use official statistics, and that gives us an objective result, and it gives us this transparency, and we can do it and upgrade the indicators from year to year. And working with indicators, it creates new opportunities for collaboration and co-creation, and it gives you a common understanding of certain challenges or problems where people with different background can still gather around the result and discuss it. So I think it's very important.
Thank you, Magnus. I think that's a good final note there. Both you and Venla kind of underscoring the importance of this common understanding, working together. It's also something that we underscore in the report. So thank you so much, Magnus, for sharing a little more about segregationsbarometer and how it's used. Interesting to also hear that you have some new surprising actors who are using it, but the important thing is that it is being used, and you can learn more about how Örebro is using it in the report, as Mats mentioned. But now I will leave the floor to you again, Mats, for the third theme.
Thanks. Right, perfect, and thank you very much, Magnus, for the excellent contributions also on your behalf. So obviously, indicators are very important, play an essential role in terms of policy development and how we can really deal with these complex issues that we are discussing today. But then another aspect that we will now dive into is the role of public participation. In our report, we examined this looking specifically at one of the questions, what kind of participatory planning approaches and processes are being used in the Nordic countries and in the different cities explored. We looked a bit into how they are organized. What does the implementation look like in terms of how they are carried out locally in the city-wide level or locally in neighborhoods? And then again, as we did with the previous theme, also looking a bit into the opportunities and challenges. We looked at Copenhagen, we looked at Tampere, we looked at Reykjavik, Sandnes in Norway, and the city of Umeå in Sweden. So the first question was really about how is this notion of public participation emphasized at the national level? Starting off with the national level, we looked at planning legislation, such as the land use and building acts in the different countries, but also planning that steers the governance of municipalities. And we see that the notion of participation is emphasized to a high degree. In many cases, it's not very specifically defined, but nonetheless, the importance of engaging the public, engaging different stakeholders is sort of a key principle in all the Nordic countries. And in addition to then the planning laws and the legislation there, we also see many specific national policies and programs where the notion of public participation has been central. One example is the Sustainable City Program in Finland, which was a national program where the principle of public participation was one of the sort of fundamental building blocks. But as mentioned, in many cases, the national frameworks define a minimum level of participation, meaning that they specify that some kind of citizen engagement should be carried out. But then the language can be rather vague, so it's not very concrete in terms of defining how public participation should be organized. But of course, this does in any case influence what kind of measures are carried out locally, but municipalities have a large degree of freedom to then choose what kinds of tools and methods they are used, and then in terms of how public participation is implemented. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see a picture from Umeå where citizen dialogue has been a key principle, and where this kind of dialogue bicycle was used to engage citizens across different parts of the city. So that really is a concrete example of how then cities implement this ambition of engaging the public and sort of implementing this kind of democratic process. But then in terms of how organization and the implementation looks like at the local level, we examined different cities across the Nordics, cities of different sizes, to then look at these more sort of practical aspects and what the reality looks like. We see that it's a strategic priority in pretty much all of the cities that we examined. In the city strategy, it's emphasized that the city should be planned in a way that citizens have a say in decisions that affect them. And then a wide range of different types of approaches are used. Just to mention one example, the city of Tampere uses a wide array of surveys, dialogue-based approaches, participatory budgeting, where the city allocates a specific sum, and then the residents can propose how this sum of money should be carried out, how it should be used in terms of then concrete planning projects in different parts of the city. So that's one concrete example. And then, of course, another aspect in the city of Tampere is also citizen-led urban development, which has been a strong focus in many parts of the cities. And on the slide here, we see a picture of a community-based sauna, which was built in the Hiedanranta district of Tampere, in close collaboration with local actors and organizations. The other example, one of the other examples is the city of Umeå, where this kind of extended consultation of the population has been carried out, citizen dialogue, and where public engagement really is a core priority of the city. So, of course, then going into what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, what are the key considerations to think about? Of course, first of all, we can start off by saying that, participation can be seen as a prerequisite for democracy, and effective sort of participatory planning is a way to certainly to enhance social inclusion, but also important to acknowledge that there may be a need to have targeted outreach efforts to reach different population groups. And a common challenge across the cities that we examined is that there is it is rather problematic and more difficult to engage the more silent, passive, and marginalized groups. So then to consider these different demographic and socioeconomic groups is a sort of vital aspect that needs to be held in mind when implementing these types of approaches. We see that many municipalities increasingly use different types of digital tools, and there are certainly many sort of opportunities with these digital approaches. One being that they can draw in a broader audience. Also, in some of the cases that we examined, they have been able to reach, in some cases, groups that might not be sort of involved in through more conventional approaches. So that's certainly an opportunity. But on the other hand, the flip side of the coin is that some citizens face barriers in terms of having more limited access to digital tools and devices, or even digital literacy. So this is another consideration that is sort of important to have in mind. And then, as a final point, a common challenge in the municipalities, I think that we have many participants today who work in municipalities, and what we heard in the cities that we examined is that in many cases there is a sort of lack of resources for implementing different types of activities. So this in itself limits what kinds of opportunities and what kinds of options municipalities have. And another challenge, in addition to these limited resources, is more related to if a city organization is large, consisting of different administrative units, then there is not always consistency in how these methods are used. So having more internal coordination, a better flow of information within the municipal organizations could be something that would sort of enhance the implementation of these kinds of public participation approaches. And on that note, we see an image from Copenhagen, and our next external speaker is Bettina Bernhard, who we will invite, and we have a couple of questions that we would like to address with you. And
Yes,
I'll give the
good
word to
morning,
you.
Bettina. Glad to have
Good
you with us.
morning. Good morning, and thank you for having me, and congratulations on your report.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. So, Bettina, as we can see here on your title, you are an ethnographer at Co-Urban, and you guys are a design collective that provides tailored consultancy and tools that promote co-creation and democratic urban design. And with that, I wanted to kick off by asking you, from your experiences of working with Co-Urban, what do you think is important to consider when engaging with the public in urban development?
There's a couple of things that are very important, I think. One is to, of course, give voice to the people who aren't always heard or who aren't always invited, or must just present a literacy, who doesn't have maybe the literacy to respond to a public hearing or engage in a public meeting. So we need an adaptation of methods, and we need to reach out to these groups that aren't always maybe actively engaging on their own initiative. And then I think another really important aspect is continuity, because depending on the project, the size and the scope, when we speak about urban development, some of these projects reaches 5, 10, or even more so years. And what the planning law stipulates we should do in terms of participation are just an instance of it. So if we have a project that stretches over 10 years, we have to, continue inviting people to share. And also we might have demographic changes within that time as well. So continuity and having the opportunity for people to be heard.
Thanks. And then I mentioned some of the sort of opportunities and challenges already here in my presentation, but thinking more about these kinds of challenges, is there something like in addition that you would like to emphasize based on the work that you have been doing in your organization as being specifically challenging?
I think you mentioned the resources that goes into it, and very often they're a bit undershot, I think. It is quite demanding to do public participation thoroughly. So the resources that are located for it, whether that is internally within cities or municipalities, or if it's for external consultants like myself, that is a challenge sometimes. There's also, in some instances, there is an RFP, request for proposal, or there is a tender that stipulates how a project should be conducted. That can also be very limiting in terms of how or who we can engage, and also again the resources that would be allocated to recruiting those people. If if the project stipulates that there should be 2, 3, 4 types of meetings or workshops, then there isn't really much room for us to go out and say, well, we actually need to do this with teenagers, or we actually need to do something completely different to get access to this other group.
Well, following up then, what value do you think this public participation really has? I mean, do you have any examples of it actually generating concrete results?
I mean, I think the value it can have is enormous, but I think it really depends again on the scope. And I will say that smaller projects will probably have a greater opportunity because they are, or local, I should say, maybe not smaller in terms of size of budget, but those who are very local, I think can have great impact. I also think if they are governed or run bottom up, so run by communities members or NGOs or social enterprises or people who are members of the community to begin with. I think especially talking about underserved areas and segregation, or areas that have been impacted by these legislation packages of segregation and that discourse over time, there's not, or there could is sometimes very little trust in processes if there is again a region or a municipality or these from a legal perspective, from a a city perspective that come and want to do participation. So sometimes it just needs to start locally as well. And I will also say that I've been involved a few times, or I've been engaged through with private developers through one of their consultants, and where I've been invited to do citizen engagement work for the competition tender. And I think that's really interesting, because then we can add a whole report, or we can add citizens' values, wishes, desires to the competition. If they're not heard in their proposals, then hopefully that's not one of the proposals that the developer will go for. So I think that's also one way of giving more power to participants, or to citizens, I should say.
Thank you, Bettina. And do you have any specific projects that you've worked on that you'd like to highlight? I know in the report we mention senior-friendly Copenhagen, I believe, which is an initiative that Co-Urban worked on. But is there any other good examples you think you could highlight?
Yeah, I think another example that was also briefly mentioned in the report is an area called the Urban 13, which is an area that is geographically split between the city of Frederiksberg and the city of Copenhagen. And it's about 4,000 square meters, and it's governed or administrated by a local social enterprise. So it's a very small organization that do culture, community engagement, sports activities for kids and young people. And we've also done sort of subsections in that area on with a lens of feminist urbanism that we've been involved with. And I think that there are a lot of people who can sense that there's a strong ownership there and that have been involved through the process. So it reaches a lot of people in a nice way without having a top-down approach in any way. So I think it's a really cool and interesting area to look at. And for the Finnish, we just got a sauna. This is under a highway, I can add. So we just got a sauna there. So there's something for everyone.
Sauna's taking over the Nordics.
It certainly is.
Yeah. Yes, important in all urban planning. But I see also here in the chat, we have a comment about the work being done in Tampere, which is also one of the case studies on electronic residence councils, which is where residents can answer different surveys. So both looking at the online, but also the in-person consultation elements. But with that, we'd like to thank you so much, Bettina, for joining us and highlighting the work of Co-Urban. And we're now going to move to the fourth and final theme of the report. Over to you, Mats.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so then moving from the previous theme, I would say that it's very closely connected also to the next theme. We previously talked about how participatory planning approaches are implemented, focusing more than on the organization of these processes and challenges and opportunities that are related. But now we will focus a bit more then on what happens and in terms of then interventions to improve the physical living environment in parallel with also improving the social living environment in neighborhoods. As urban planning is obviously a key tool that can be used when we're talking about creating cities that are more inclusive and less segregated. We explored 3 questions here in this part of the report. The first one was, again, I mentioned in the very beginning that a guiding principle throughout the report is this multi-level governance aspect. So we have looked at how these different themes, how they are reflected in national policies, programs, and planning guidelines and legislation. And that also applies to this theme. So here we looked at how was the role of the physical living environment in connection to the social inclusion aspect? How was that mentioned and emphasized in these different kinds of national policy documents and strategies? The second question then is more about in terms of implementing these types of interventions, the aim is to improve the physical living environment, create higher quality urban environments, but how can this actually help foster social inclusion, well-being, trust, and community? So these were the key aspects that we were interested here in the second question. And then, of course, a common theme is also looking at what are the opportunities and challenges. So with this, we will then reflect a bit on what are sort of key considerations to have in mind when talking about implementing these kinds of interventions. In this segment of the study, we looked at the city of Aarhus in Denmark, the Finnish city of Lahti, Reykjavik, Bergen in Norway, and Gothenburg in Sweden. So starting off with the national level, again, this is something that we see across the Nordic countries, that there are national policies emphasizing the connection between the physical living environment and the social living environment. This is maybe most concretely manifested in national architectural policies that we have in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. The Finnish architectural policy, the national policy, specifically emphasizes the role of the built environment, and that a high quality built environment is something that can help foster social inclusion and also reduce inequality. So this is a specific goal that is sort of formulated there. And then in Sweden, there's a specific relation to the notion of segregation, and here that sort of promoting the creation of safe, inclusive environments through urban planning is something that can help reduce segregation and improve local living conditions. So at the national level, we have these architectural policies, but also many cities have their own architectural policies, like the cities of Aarhus and Lahti and Bergen that we explored in our study. And here the Bergen Inclusion Center that we see on the picture is an initiative from a few years back or I think it might be from previous year, where the intention has been to create this kind of community center, which helps strengthen social inclusion in the city. So then looking then a bit into what kinds of effects these types of planning interventions then have on these more social aspects that we are now talking about. The city of Aarhus, one of the city cases that we studied, here we found that there is a strong notion of the acknowledgement of the need to create socially inclusive neighborhoods, and this is a prioritized strategic emphasis. So there's a lot of focus on creating a physically accessible city, focusing on universal design, making public spaces more accessible for different people of different ages and abilities, providing diverse housing options. So this is acknowledged in many ways, but we also see the limitations that despite these ambitions, there is still a lack of affordable housing. So really underlining the importance of having multiple sort of entry points when we talk about dealing with segregation, having policy measures dealing with different policy areas. Also, the city of Gothenburg, here we see an example from the neighborhood of Bergsjön, where a new culture house was recently built. And this has been, in many ways, can be seen as a successful example where it has improved the vitality of the local living environment. And specifically also because it was designed in sort of close consideration to the local needs and through close involvement of local associations and other key actors. But it also underlines that sort of localized action in terms of these kinds of interventions can be very useful in improving the livability, but then in terms of reducing segregation, the effects are more limited. So then what are the key aspects that are good to keep in mind? We will soon follow up on this in a short Q&A as well. But of course, one issue that I thought is worth highlighting, that addressing segregation and social inclusion. It's something that requires both political will and sufficient resources. And these are sort of important prerequisites for any kind of policy measure to be successful. What we also see is that, especially in the larger municipalities, that there is not always a clear, comprehensive overview of what kind of different actions are carried out. I mentioned this previously also in connection to indicators and how different types of indicators are used, but also in relation to this aspect, there seems to be a better need for internal cooperation, coordination, information sharing to work in a more sort of coordinated way, and to overcome a more sort of fragmented silo way of working that still might be sort of prevalent. And then this brings us to the last point, or which is kind of like a question that I also wanted to pose to all of us collectively. So could it be advantageous to really think about this in a way that we would have a more clearly defined home base for overseeing segregation and social inclusion? Now it seems that the responsibilities are rather fragmented and dispersed across different departments within the municipalities, or if we're talking about the national level between different state levels, that maybe it could be advantageous to sort of think about this in a more holistic and cross-cutting way, and doing that by having a more specifically delineated home base for addressing these issues. And then, Annika, please, I welcome you back.
Thank you so much, Mats, and for covering this final theme. We have quite a lot of interesting comments in the chat, so I'm going to turn to those as well. But I thought I would start by asking you then, Mats, really, what value do interventions in the physical environment have in creating more socially inclusive cities?
I think that they have a very important role in terms of creating more, sort of enhancing the local living environment, creating a more livable local neighborhood that reflects the needs and the wishes of the local residents. I think it's also symbolically, it should not be a symbolic, something that is done symbolically, but it also signals that if interventions are carried out in all types of areas, that no areas are left behind or neglected, because then if in some parts of the world, that is actually what happens, that some neighborhoods are left into despair. Right. So that does kind of signal a kind of hopelessness that there is no intention even to sort of eradicate the problems or improve the local conditions. But then, there is surely a lot of merit. But then going back to the bigger question of segregation that we have talked about here today, and what the report addresses, there, on the other hand, if we only would focus on these kinds of more local interventions, then there might be a risk that we only deal with the sort of the symptoms of segregation and not what the root causes of sort of the bigger phenomenon. So based on the study, I would say that they are important, but when we're talking about creating less segregated cities specifically, then it's also important to, in parallel, have different types of policy measures spanning areas such as housing, integration, social policy, to name a few. So then, we need to have a holistic, cross-cutting approach to dealing with these issues, because merely sort of tackling the physical living environment will only have a certain effect.
And I've seen here in the chat came up a sort of a comment about the role of ethnicity and whether that is included in sort of these indicators, but certainly is it included in urban planning? Because often there can be different needs with different ethnicities. So sort of a question, how much is that looked at in addressing a segregation, would you say?
I would say that there is increased acknowledgement that not necessarily specifically focusing on ethnicity, but the need to sort of have targeted efforts to reach specific population segments, where it could be different ethnic groups, but it could also be different age groups. A lot of the initiatives also focus on addressing older people. Many of the examples that we also studied have a strong focus on youth and children. So surely acknowledging the diversity of the population in terms of both ethnic background, socioeconomic background, different demographic backgrounds, that is certainly something that is sort of vital.
And if we go a little bit past, I'm going to go to some other questions I've seen here in the chat. If we go past just looking at the physical living environment, going back maybe to public participation, we have the participant raising the reason for the lack of trust that is sometimes seen in these public participations, sort of that, you get feedback and then you never hear back. Is that something that we've seen or were identified in the cases?
Certainly, that was something that was highlighted in several of the examples. That I think that that's why it's important to not just implement participation as a symbolic gesture, to do it as for the sake of involving, because the planning legislation says that you should listen.
Check a box.
Yeah. So if that's done and the people who are involved do not really see any value of their involvement, if the people who sort of participate and do not see that their participation has any kind of concrete implications or sort of that's taken into account, that will certainly be something that could be counterproductive and lead to a lack of trust. So in that sense, how these processes are implemented with consideration to different sort of target groups is very important.
You mentioned the Umeå case in the report. Do you think that is a good example of where it actually has become a part of an actual planning process, or these dialogues, bicycle dialogues, or?
Yeah, I would say that Umeå is a good example, because there the engagement was done through different kinds of approaches, different types of in different geographic districts, with specific focus on different target groups, ranging from children, also initiatives carried out in schools. Certainly, I think that probably all municipalities would say that they could do more, but I think that is a good example of how this sort of is being tackled in a pretty comprehensive way. And also, I think that having resources to implement this is sort of vital, as I think has been mentioned already in the chat.
Yes, and I'm going to take one final question here before we move on, and that's sort of back to the urban planning. How can urban planning address issues of inclusion and community regeneration in segregated neighborhoods while simultaneously preventing the rising rents and displacement often associated with gentrification? Easy question.
That's a very complex question. I'm not sure if I caught every part of that question, but
sort of in regenerating, and I think we talk about it in the report, in regenerating neighborhoods, there is this risk then of displacing who was there before. So what are some of the ways of preventing that?
If we're talking about public housing, then there's certainly more there are more possibilities than to have some kind of subsidies to sort of ensure that displacement of the population would not happen. But then if we're talking about market sort of privately owned housing, then it might be difficult to control that. But I think that brings us to the point that, I mean, affordable housing is an important sort of prerequisite for having inclusive cities. Not all people can afford the expensive housing, especially in the larger cities. So
Yeah.
they're having a sort of active housing policy that acknowledges these issues is sort of crucial.
Yes, thank you, Mats. And before we move on to the sort of final segment for today, I'm going to launch another quick poll. Now we've presented all 4 themes, and it would just be interesting for us to hear from your perspective what you think is the most important in tackling urban segregation and planning for inclusive cities. We saw earlier that most of you had an interest in the first item there, national policies, but also equal level of interest in public participation in the built environment, and less so on indicators. So it'll be interesting to see if your interests and then also what you think is actually most important are the same. So while you all are busy answering that, I'm also gonna then, I guess, just leave, we're gonna introduce Janna, our final discussant, so to speak. So Janna Nevalainen is a senior specialist at the Ministry of Environment in Finland. Thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to have you with us.
Welcome, Janna.
Am I right, Mats? Did you want to do a few slides before we give Janna some questions?
No. I think that
Okay.
we can go directly to the questions.
Good.
And now, Janna, you work at the Finnish Ministry of the Environment. So I was thinking that it would be very interesting now, since we have carried out a Nordic study, to hear a bit what kind of key learnings you think we can draw from. Obviously, you work at the national level in Finland, and our participants are primarily people who work. It could be either at the national level or at regional councils or in municipalities. But we work more nationally or locally. But what kind of key learnings and added value do you see of this kind of Nordic comparison? And what learnings can we draw from this study, do you think?
Oh, hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to hear the final results of this study, because I heard this at the very early stage already some years ago. But what comes to Mats' question, I think we all working national or local or regional level, we always need an inspiration. We also need hope, at least I hope, proven evidence how different things and measures work in reality. Of course, we don't have one size fits for all solutions for segregation and inclusive cities, but when you see what is done in other countries, other cities, you have a better understanding how to use these different methods, what measures might work, or how to adjust these measures to your local or national policies and real actions. I think that's the value of these kind of studies.
Thank you so much. So really the importance of inspiration, examples, also other data to come with from the Nordics. It's easy, I think, to be so focused on the national issues, and the moment you can lift your eye line and see how the other Nordic countries are tackling it, it has value. But then if we do go to Finland, Janna, and your work there, are there any specific examples that you think should be highlighted of the work that you are doing in Finland that could be relevant for the other Nordic countries?
Well, of course, because I need to highlight our suburban neighborhood programs. We have had 3 of them since 2008, and of course, it's even we don't have a national level strategy, we have had these national level programs, of course, based on local actions and local implementation of these key principles given by the programs, these programs. And but it's there we come also these key findings of this study. You are separated them from 4 thematic areas, but usually you need to put all these together, and that's we have done with these national programs, and it also highlights the need. Of course, we haven't have these programs has been for 3 years. Real actions, but it highlights the need of the long-term work. This program model gives some advantage, but you need long-term work, and I would like to highlight that. That's one of these things that we have seen and learned. And among these neighborhood programs, I would like to highlight one program from the other ministry. We have cooperated together, of course, and these actions and this program has been part of these neighborhood programs, but program for quality and equality in early childhood and comprehensive school education. Because it goes to the root causes level. And you need to combine these different actions and different measures from different field of if you want to tackle the root causes of segregation, you need to combine these different approaches and different policies together.
Thank you, Jana. And maybe a difficult follow-up question, but as you mentioned, sort of the long term and how important that is. Obviously, this is a challenge when governments change and priorities change or strategies change. So how do you think you can best sort of plan for the long term with those factors? And I think Mats also mentioned it in the presentation and in the report, how challenging that can be when things sort of change with new governments.
Of course, it's really challenging. I've seen that in not just the national but also local level. That it's really challenging. And well, unfortunately, I don't have a
secret recipe
to solve that problem. But I think the cooperation that people work together, you have understanding the need of the multi-sectoral approach, because there is always, even sometimes when you don't have that strong political initiative, you can do something at the local level and also national level. You can cooperate, you can work together, you can see how these different policies and actions can tackle the problem. So to make it sort of bridging these different eras that when it's more strong, you need to bridge and build the bridges between them.
And then maybe finally to loop back to Mats's earlier sort of open question then, and this call for maybe a home base for these issues, whether nationally or locally. Do you think that would be important? Is it something that you're already trying to achieve in the Finnish, on the national level, to sort of coordinate on these issues? What does that look like right now?
Well, of course, it's coordinating. It's much easier when you have a real program. You have a strategy to do something. But we have had long-term initiative to work together, national level and local level, and put these different levels together to talk, to change ideas, to knowledge. So yes, it's something that we have been thinking, but both are equally important. Of course, it's easier to tackle these root causes from the national level, but we need both. We need both levels because there are many things that we can't do from the national level. So local actors are really, really important.
They're vital. Well, thank you so much, Janna, for joining us and for your perspective. And a big thank you to all our previous speakers as well, Venla, Bettina, and Magnus. We're not bringing them back for a final panel, but I see in the chat you guys are sorting out some questions and correspondence. And you're, of course, also welcome to follow up with us afterwards. Mats, any final words from you?
Yeah, maybe just the final word from me. I want to thank everyone, firstly, all the external panelists. I think that this was very, very helpful because in many cases, you brought insights from your local or national perspectives. And also having Janna's final points here about the importance of now that we structured the report and the presentation in a way that we looked at different thematic areas. But I also wanted to, as a final point here, highlight the importance of seeing this in combination and not viewing these as separate blocks, but rather if we want to deal with segregation, then we need to see all of this as a whole. So thank you so much on my behalf, and the report should be available today.
Yes. It's out on our website. We've shared the link in the chat. You'll also get an email with the presentation and the report and the recording in the coming days. I also, before we go, I'd like to mention a forthcoming report we have that's launching in May. That's titled Nordic Cities, Pathways Towards Climate Neutrality. So please have a look out for that and sign up to the Nordic Region newsletter if you'd like to stay on top of all of our publications. So that's it for me. Thank you all so much for joining us and taking the time and for being so active in the chat. We really appreciated it. We're launching a quick poll here with some feedback. We'd love to hear from you and keep improving. Wishing all of you in Finland and Sweden particularly a happy Valborg. But thank you and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.